Hello and welcome to Rye Toast. This is the story of my Uncle Harry and how he almost lost his life in one of the most infamous battles of World War II, as told by his sister Hannah, my mother, in a 1977 interview. It begins with the outbreak of war in September 1939. Soon after, Harry joined the British Army, and when the intense bombing of England began in 1940, he was stationed at Birkenhead near Liverpool and was involved in the often gruesome cleanup of the devastation, something he didn't talk about until many years after the war. In 1942 and into 1943, he served in North Africa, where the first major Allied victory of the war resulted in the defeat of the German and Italian armies. The Allied focus then shifted to the liberation of Europe. Mum's original 1977 recording has been digitized and cleaned up through the magic of AI software, but you may still hear an occasional blip or two. Over to you, Mum.
He'd gone all through the desert, right up to North Africa, and they had so many prisoners there, he was doing guard duty, guarding the Italians and German prisoners. He just got fed up. So when they asked for volunteers to join the paratroops, he volunteered, and he did his training in Palestine, as it was then. And he liked it very much. He saw what the country was. He'd tell if it was a beautiful city, Jaffa, Haifa. He said they were the twin cities. They're not far from each other, Jaffa and Haifa. And he said you could tell which was which by the terrible stink. He said there was no other word for it. Dreadful conditions that the Arabs lived under in those days. And he was terribly compassionate about the children. He took photographs of the children, those beautiful children. You see in their eyes flies, and in a year or two they would have been completely blind, suffering from this disease. It's not glaucoma, I can't remember the disease. And just apart from terrible sights that he saw some beautiful places, biblical places, holy to Jews and Christians and Mohammedans, and he saw them. And then in 1944, his first actual combat drop was at Caen in France. Before they went, they were briefed that if anything went wrong, they were on their own. They had to find their own way back. And he was dropped there, and he was wandering around for 9 days with a couple of others. And eventually, he made his way back to a British-held part, for which he was extremely thankful, as you may well imagine. And then he was dropped on Rhodes and Lear off the Greek island. But the most terrible experience that he had was at Arnhem. When he was dropped into the forest at Arnhem, he landed badly, first of all, and his walkie-talkie broke. So he was out of touch immediately. And the reason for the confusion was that as they were dropping the men, and the supplies were being dropped into the enemy line, so they had nothing to back them up with, you see. They only had a few bits and pieces. Fortunately, he was with his friend, who's his friend to this very day. He's always at Harry's house. They're great friends. Anyhow, they managed to make their way through the forest at Arnhem. And everybody was touchy. He says, goodness knows how many of their own men they must have shot in the confusion. They had to assemble a certain point, and he managed to do this. And they had to march all night through the towns, and they were so frightened, and they were so exhausted, that nature is such that when you're very frightened, you just sleep. And they just dropped into the gutter, and they couldn't go any further. Nature just blocks everything out. You see, that's how people become unconscious. You just want to forget everything. And the following morning, they started their march again. They saw the German tanks coming towards them. And of course, to make a tank ineffective against you, you have to go right up to it. You can't get on the caterpillars, but there's a thing that you can get onto there. And if you can get onto that or get right near, you see, the guns can't go right down, you see. So you have to have a certain sort of strength to be able to go up to it. And you grow a sort of armor, but you're frightened, and yet you force yourself to do something that you know is for your own good, but you're dreadfully scared about. So that's what they had to do, go right up to the tanks, because the guns can't go right down. So that was their only defense, because their machine gun, Bren guns, or whatever they were, gone. And he managed, with some other fellows, to jump into a cellar. And they were being bombarded. 88mm shells, and one finally exploded in the cellar where he was. And the two fellows, one on either side, were killed outright, and he was injured. And after that, he remembers very little. Spasmodically, he remembers various things. He remembers that he was carried to a field by the medical men. And all night, fellows were dying around him, gurgling and dying. And all night long, it was thumping and screaming of shells. And the poor British soldiers, they had nothing. And they were just all around and they were dying. The sights they must have seen, he doesn't say very much. This that I'm telling you, it took him years to tell me all these things, little by little. And then one night, his commanding officer came to all the injured and said, "We'll have to move out. We can't stay here." And they had to go across the river from Holland across the enemy line, separating the two countries. And he said, every man for himself. The only people allowed to come are the people that can come under their own steam. Anybody who's injured cannot come. If they can walk and get by, they can come, but nobody is to help anybody else. It's every man for himself. So, of course, he was injured. His leg was injured. So they were left, and the officer called for volunteers to stay with the injured, and some of the medics stayed with them, and the officer said, "Empty your pockets of cigarettes, sweets, or whatever you got, and leave it with the injured." So they left it, and the others swam across the river. Whoever could get by, and he was left. The Germans came along, took them, and he was taken to Apeldoorn in Holland. He was in hospital there, looked after by some Dutch doctors. And he was interrogated by the Germans. He was taken to an interrogation center. They asked him what his name was. They asked him what his number was, what his regiment was, who his mother was, where he lived in England. And he just couldn't remember. He was in a daze. And when they saw that he couldn't answer, they told him who he was, what regiment he was in, where he'd come from. They'd seen all in his book. You see, they carry the books with them, and he had also his dog tag. You see, they knew everything about him. And when they told him, it's little bits and pieces came back to him. You see. Anyhow, he was taken to this hospital in Apeldoorn, and he was told, couple of nurses said, when these other nurses come along, don't say anything to them because they are collaborators. And while he was actually in the hospital in Apeldoorn, some of the people there had been taken to the square and shot. And one of the nurses, she was weeping, and they asked her why, and they said that her uncle had been shot. There'd been some sabotage. And they'd just taken people off the street and lined them up in the square and shot them, and her uncle had been one of them. And then one day, all the injured were going to be moved out. They didn't know where they were going, and it was snowing. He couldn't walk, so the stretchers were left on the floor, and he was lying there, and he felt something under the covers, and it was an apple. The nurses came round and quickly, so that nobody should see, they'd slipped in a little something for the soldiers. They were taken to some remote railway station in Germany, and he was left on the stretcher, out of shelter with all the snow pouring down on him, and shivering with cold in the winter time. And as he was there, a German woman came along, shuffling along there quickly, and he didn't take very much notice. Next thing he knew, there was an umbrella over him. And she rushed away. She'd taken pity on him, because the snow was falling on him and he wasn't under the cover at all. So little things that you remember like that. Then he was taken, it was 100 miles north of Leipzig. I'll tell you how we know. He wrote to tell us while he was still in England. He was up at Market Harbour at the time, and it was September, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and he couldn't get down for it. He says that all leave had been cancelled. We didn't know about Arnhem at that time. I mean, that hadn't happened yet. But he couldn't get leave. And then, about 2 or 3 weeks after Arnhem, we hadn't heard, received a letter. It was addressed to my mother, but I saw this official letter and I was dreading it. I opened it and I read, and I'll never forget it. Harris Levy, with his number. Known to have been wounded, believed killed, listed as missing. Didn't tell my mother. And I couldn't do anything very suspicious. I couldn't phone. I couldn't say I'm going to do this all of a sudden, you see, because, my mother wasn't a fool. So I remember she'd made me my favourite salad, and I had this lovely fish, and I ate it. I couldn't swallow. I ate it. I remember that so vividly. I can still see the colours of the salad to this very day, and I could not eat it. And I went to work the following morning, and then I started to cry. And my boss was Major Fremantle, a lovely man. And he said, "What?" And I told him. And he says, "Well, don't worry about it. I'll see what I can do." Because I worked for the War Office. So anyway, he says, "Do you want me to phone anybody?" I said, "I can't tell my mother anything at all about it." And I said, "I'm sorry, making a fool of myself." He said, "Oh, not at all." I said, "I just have to let it out to somebody. I can't tell anybody. My one brother is in the Air Force, the other one's goodness knows where. I can't tell anybody about it, anybody who matters." So anyway, I managed to telephone. Dan was in a reserved occupation because of his eyes, you see. He couldn't do, his eyes were too bad. And I phoned him. And I told him that I hadn't told Mum. So he says, "Well, we'll have to tell her that, we'll have to tell her for the time being that he's a prisoner of war." So I said, "Okay." And he said, "Give me all the details." And they got onto the War Office. They couldn't tell us anything more than already been written. They didn't know. Everything was chaotic. They didn't know anything at all. So in the Jewish Chronicle, they put an advertisement, Harry's regiment and all the relevant details, where he'd been, who his sergeant was, everything. A little while after that, we get a letter. Somebody had been travelling in a train, and he'd heard, and these soldiers, they were in the paratroop regiment, and they were talking about someone called Louis Levy. Now, in those days, Louis Levy was a conductor, and he always composed film music. There was Mule Matheson and Louis Levy, conducted by Louis Levy, and my brother, being Harry Levy, was always called Louis. That was his nickname, Louis Levy. And they'd heard them talking about Louis Levy, how they'd seen him get wounded. And this fellow wrote and said, "As far as I know, he was one of the wounded, and he was alive when I last saw him. Harry was alive. He was with the wounded." So we tried to work from there with the Red Cross, but there was an absolute blank wall of silence. So we told our mother that he was a prisoner of war. "How do you know?" "Well, we've got it through the Red Cross." And we said, "Now the war's over for Harry." You could see she didn't believe him. Anyhow, this was about November. And I don't know. I would keep an open mind about these things. I don't say I'm a believer in anything perhaps supernatural or anything. Perhaps one's mind makes people think and do things because of love or hate. In this case, it was love. My mother came to me one morning and she says, I had a dream last night. She said, I had a dream. She says, I feel everything will be all right. I said, what do you mean everything will be all right? She said, we'll hear from Harry. I'm sure he's all right. I said, what's your dream? She said, well, I dreamt of your father. She says, we were in this lovely big bed together and we had a baby in our bed. And it was a beautiful baby. And I was holding this baby and hugging him. And all of a sudden, I dropped him on the floor and I screamed. And I said to your father, oh, I've dropped the baby. The baby's dead. Nobody could console me. I was so upset. I was crying, and in my dream I was crying and screaming. And my father, she says, your father was shaking me. He says, don't feel it. She says, look, the baby's alive. She says, I don't want to look, I don't want to look, I don't want to look. The baby's dead. And she was so upset. So he made her take her hands away from her eyes. And he says, now look. And she said she looked down on the floor. And there was this baby lying. Who the baby was, she doesn't know, but it was a beautiful baby that she's been holding. And he was lying on the floor with his big blue eyes, she says, wide open, gurgling away as babies do. She said, I think it's a lovely dream. My mother had this dream in November, and about 2 weeks later, maybe a week later, the beginning of November, we had a letter from Harry, from Starlag 1X3. We didn't know where it was, you see. And it was just about that size with lines on it. And they were only allowed to write how much they could get on this letter. And the other part was just for the address. We all went through the Red Cross, you see. And it said, not to worry, and prisoner of war. Just a few lines, because we were so relieved. War Office still didn't know anything about it, so they had been informed officially. The Red Cross help, they were marvellous, and we wanted to know where Stalag 9C was, and they said it was about 100 miles north of Leipzig. He was very seriously wounded, incidentally, and reading between the lines, I was very, very worried. I thought that if ever I saw my brother again, he would have one leg. They had no anesthetic, they had no bandages, they used something like toilet paper, crepe paper. And they didn't want to be bothered with anybody who was ill. They had, because the Germans at that time in 1944 had nothing. And anything that they had went to their own soldiers. Even their own civilians had very little. It all went to the soldiers. They didn't want to be bothered because he had osteomyelitis, bone rot. Osteomyelitis, the bone was actually rotting in his ankle. And the German doctor said, amputate. Well, they had a Dutch doctor who was also a prisoner of war then. He said, I'll look after him. I'm quite sure that we can save his leg. Let me see to it. Eventually, it was because of this Dutch doctor that they saved his leg. And it was just bound up with paper. And he was in dreadful pain, as you might guess. The Red Cross used to deliver parcels. We used to send parcels regularly. We sent little things, we sent chocolate, tin food, anything that we could lay our hands on. Because everything was rationed in those days. The Germans used to take everything and keep it for themselves, might give them a bit of chocolate or something or other. But what they existed mainly on was potato soup in the prisoner of war camps. And to get more rations, the Germans used to bribe the French and the American and English prisoners to join their corps. They used to recruit them from the prisoner of war camps. Of course, a lot of fellows never went, but quite a number used to go and were soldiers for the Germans to get more food, you've seen. He was a prisoner of war from September 1944 to April 1945, about a month or so before the war ended. Now, they used to have exchanges of prisoners. The Germans used to exchange their wounded prisoners for our wounded prisoners. And of course, it was the ones that were so badly wounded that they couldn't really get them better in time to fight again. And Harry was one of these. So he was repatriated, and we were told about it. So I said to my mother, look, it's no use you going. I had to come all the way from Tunbridge over to High Wycombe. He was at the hospital there, and I was put up by some people in Chalfont St Giles, or Chalfont St Peter, in Buckingham. They volunteered to have staying with them relatives of the wounded prisoners who had been repatriated. So I stayed with these people over the weekend. Oh, they were charming people. They wouldn't take a penny. They had two lovely little girls. It was really nice. I used to correspond with them quite a lot at one time. Anyhow, he was at this hospital at High Wycombe, and I went to see him, and I was dreading it. He was all shaven, and he looked skin and bone. Honestly, he was really frightening. He was yellow, and he had this great big thing on his leg. He really looked like the Walking Dead. And of course, he had to be deloused. He had to have his hair shaved. The clothes that he stood up in, they had to burn, all the prisoners. He was suffering from dysentery. They all were. He was there for several months. He was there for, I can't remember, but he was there for a good 6 months. He was hobbling about on crutches, and then on 2 sticks. He had to wear a special shoe. He refused to wear this special shoe. He says that he doesn't want to be a cripple. And he learned to walk properly without this. He's got a locked ankle. If you ever see him cross his leg, it's always like that. See, he can't go like this. His ankle is locked. He hasn't been able to do this for 30-odd years. So his foot is always up like this. And when he gets tired, then he limps. But he had to go before a board about a month before I came here, a military board, because he gets a disability pension. Not very much, because they don't treat their soldiers very well in England. You know that, don't you? But anyway, thank God he can earn a good living himself. He's a shipping lawyer, and thank God we got him home from the war.
Thanks, Mum. The invasion of France began on June the 6th, 1944, D-Day, and the Battle of Caen, where Harry saw action, was a pivotal and brutal step on the way to the liberation of the country. 2 months later, the Allies were poised to enter Germany itself, and to do that they needed to capture the key strategic bridge at Arnhem in Holland. The operation was codenamed Market Garden and was the largest airborne action in history. It was a disaster. Of the original force of 12,000 men, only a third made it home, and almost 1,500 were killed. More than half were taken prisoner. My Uncle Harry was one of them. Until next time, this is Right Toast.